Welcome home. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We hope you set a spot out on your dial for us. We're going to be dialing up the Maryland Crab Cake Tour very soon, all month long, into December. Tons of dates, tons of friends, post-election stuff, all are brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Lottery. I'll have Ravens scratch-offs to give away. Hopefully, this is as lucky a batch as the Ravens were on Thursday night against the Cincinnati Bengals. Also, our friends at Jiffy Lube Multicare sending Luke back and forth. And of course, our 26th anniversary and our Oyster Tour, all brought to you by Curio Wellness, Far and Daughter, as well as Liberty Pure Solutions, keeping the water running clean. And I'll be hydrating here for the next 4 years, if not the next 10 days. Luke Jones joins us now after an interesting evening at the bank, as they would say. Losing by 2 touchdowns late in the third quarter. Lots of points go up on the board, missed extra point. I don't know where to begin. I'll begin with this. Joe Burrow is a really good quarterback. And I'll also begin with this. The Ravens are a better team than the Bengals are right now.
They are, and Lamar Jackson's the best player in football right now. Joe Burrow's great. I agree. Lamar Jackson's playing on another world right now. It's another level right now, and the Ravens needed that. And we'll talk a lot about the defense as we continue to talk about the defense every single week. But Marlon Humphrey said it himself. Lamar Jackson and the offense are carrying this football team right now, absolutely carrying them. And it was a very strange game, a game that kind of sort of felt like a defensive struggle for a while, or at least looked that way on the scoreboard in the first half. And then the score finishes 35-34 and ends up being the shootout many of us anticipated or expected. So, but two quarterbacks playing at a very high level. The Ravens offense continuing to do what it's done, despite a very choppy, very, at times lethargic and at times just flat out unproductive first half. And a Bengals offense that was without T. Higgins, was without Orlando Brown, was without one of their tight ends that they lost to an ACL last week. And, well, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase continue to work and work and work and then work some more. But Lamar Jackson and the Ravens offense, they had a little bit more in the tank and they had more weapons to utilize across the field. So tremendous football game. I mean, we talked about this with back in week 5, the overtime thriller in Cincinnati, and talking about a game that the Ravens won that frankly felt like they shouldn't have won. This game was more back and forth. I mean, certainly Cincinnati, the turning point was the fumble and Marlon Humphrey forcing that fumble. So at least the defense did make a play at a point where they absolutely needed it, down 2 scores, as you mentioned. But uh, still, ultimately at the end, the MVP of the league through the first 10 weeks is Lamar Jackson, and he made a few more plays. And the Ravens defense, at the very least, they got the stop on the 2-point conversion, penalties or not. And, and certainly there were plenty of people who opined about that, but the Ravens get a
I don't
win.
know, dude. I might have kicked the ball. I mean, if I were them. I mean, that's always the question about winning or losing. We can win it right here. I didn't love the way the Bengals were playing, even though they were in the end zone. I thought they needed a breather, to be honest with you. I thought kick the ball, get the 35 seconds, get Lamar to his knees, get off the field, and then figure it out in overtime. Give yourself some breath, because I felt like that would have been better for them. But hey, they went for it. Uh, there were a lot of third and fourth down plays where Joe Burrow just played chuck and duck. And then Chiefs caught one later on that the only way you're gonna enact one of those kind of plays. But I don't think it was a curious decision. I think on the road you would say the book says go for it. I didn't. I love the Ravens' chances on that, because I didn't love the Ravens. I didn't love the way either one of these teams were playing 4 days after all of this, all of the injuries. It felt like the Bengals were missing a huge complement in their offense, and it felt to me like running the ball was tough for the Ravens, especially early on in Derrick Henry, and they couldn't score points and they couldn't control the ball. I don't know. I would have kicked the ball. I didn't tweet that or anything at 11 o'clock at night, but I would have kicked the ball.
I mean, they could have, and the Ravens could have marched down the field and scored. I mean, they're not going to take a knee there. I mean, they're going to try to score. The Ravens had scored four touchdowns on 4 straight possessions. So I see why they did it. And let's also be clear, the Bengals could have gotten it, and they're up one, and the Ravens still could have won the game. Now, Justin Tucker, reliability there. I mean, that's something for another segment as we're just getting into this game. But I think the Bengals were appropriately aggressive. They needed to be. From the moment that the fumble happened, they couldn't stop the Ravens. Were they going to get a stop in overtime? Are you going to leave it up to the coin flip and whoever wins the coin toss in overtime? I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I didn't have a problem with them making that decision. I think they were appropriately aggressive. I didn't necessarily love their play calls in some of those situations. I mean, throwing long on third and short and fourth and short back-to-back plays was odd. But at the same
Well, they
time,
don't have a play. Their play is Burrow scramble in the pocket, out of the pocket, look up, either dirt the ball or find Jamar Chase. That was kind of their play. I mean, and on that two-pointer, it was a lousy play for them. I didn't like their odds to begin with down on the goal line. Like I don't know if on their side I didn't like their chances. I think it played into the Ravens' hands in that
I
case.
mean, maybe. At the same time, again, what about their defense showed you any confidence that they were going to stop the Ravens? I mean, and again, the Ravens could have tried to score before the end of regulation.
I thought they
So,
did an unbelievable job of running around with Lamar. They just didn't. They couldn't bring him to the ground. Just like the last time. Just like that play where Hubbard had him after the fumble and the touchdown, the play of the year. I've been a couple of play of the years lately, though. I don't know, Saquon Barkley thing. I mean, there's been some crazy stuff, but the play of the year in Cincinnati to me, that was that is the Charlie Brown of the Bengals and the Ravens. Is that Lamar's like a bumper car? I mean, like they can't get him to the ground, and that's a problem. And he was beyond brilliant in the fourth quarter, right? Like we've seen him do a lot of things. That fourth quarter's right up there. It's top fiver for him, I would say. Quarter.
absolutely. I mean, especially considering the circumstances, they're down two scores and down 14 points. I mean, we've seen this team down 10, 14 points. You have to go back a couple years, Nestor. They didn't trail by 14 points all year. They didn't trail by 14 points at any point last year. So you're
Well,
talking
you
about
know the
something.
first thing they're going to do, Luke, when they're down 14 points, they're going to abandon the run.
I
I mean,
mean,
that's what we all said, right?
in truth, but they really didn't. I mean, they still mixed in some runs. Cincinnati was stopping it. I mean, Derrick Henry was a non-factor in that game. It kind of like the first game until the overtime run where Derrick Henry busts a long run after the missed field goals. So, look, you give them credit, and maybe this is where you look at this game and say how bad the Ravens' offense was relative to what you expect in that first half and into the third quarter. Yet Cincinnati didn't grow the kind of lead that made that safe enough, right? I mean, okay, they went up 14, sure, but then they turned the ball over and they gave their ball to the Ravens on a short field. I mean, if they march down the field there and kick a field goal and they go up 17 and they don't give the Ravens a short field, we might be having a very different conversation right now. But I'll say this, and all the comparisons between Burrow and Lamar. I mean, they both put up brilliant numbers. They both were brilliant throwing the football. Lamar scrambling ability added to what he did throwing the football and throwing it all over the field. And I mean, Tylan Wallace
Well,
was
and
one of the
the
stars of
Bengals
this game.
tackling was gross too,
Sure, but
especially on the edges. I mean,
well,
just
but
like letting Lamar find that seam, letting Kylan Wallace. I mean, just PU on the tackling for the Bengals, really.
well, I mean, Tylan Wallace, Lamar does that to a lot of teams. Let's be honest, but yeah, they were allergic to tackling on the sideline. But this is the point I was getting ready to make. The Ravens are a winning football team. The Bengals are not. The Bengals have some great players. The Bengals got to a Super Bowl 3 years ago now. I mean, at how long are we going to continue to talk about that,
They only
right?
have 10 guys left on that team, right? From that team.
I mean, I don't know if it's
Maybe 12. That was
I don't
there was a lot of veterans on that team.
I mean, I don't cover the Bengals or anything like that. So, I mean, it's more than 10, but I mean, look, they have Joe Burrow, who's brilliant. They have Jamar Chase, who's brilliant. They have T. Higgins, who's a heck of a receiver, but he can't stay on the field. It's one of the reasons why they're not going to pay him. And he wasn't on the field, even though, you look at the final output and what they did through the air against this Ravens defense anyway, it didn't really matter. But their offensive line, which stunk 3 years ago, still stinks, and they were without their best offensive lineman. Let's face it, part of the story of this game and the frustration for the Ravens pass defense is that they got to Joe Burrow a lot. They pressured him a lot. The pass rush, wouldn't say it was perfect, but it was worlds better than it's been in recent weeks. And maybe part of that was just Travis Jones being back healthy and being part of the pass rush, and Matabike having his biggest game of the year. But they got pressure, and yet the Ravens still couldn't cover consistently on the back end. And look, I mean, Jamar Chase is great, yeah, but
Cover
I
him.
mean, look at the numbers. You knew that Burrow was going to go to him primarily, but at the same time, I mean, there were other guys that made plays for them, and there were, their tight ends made some plays, certainly. So, but by and large, the Ravens are 7-3. The Bengals are 4-6 at this point in time. And you can look at those two teams and look at a handful of plays in some of these games. And the Ravens have a couple blowout wins, of course, over Buffalo and Denver last week. But you kind of look at the Bengals, and as much as we have this narrative, some of it true, some of it exaggerated by the fan base, in my opinion, and media. I don't want to pick on the fans exclusively, but the things that people accuse the Ravens of being too often in terms of beating themselves and losing games they should have won. I mean, the Bengals, their entire season is that. I mean, look at some of the games that they've lost, including two against the Ravens, where you look at that and say, yeah, the two-score lead in the fourth quarter in that Week 5 meeting, and they had a 14-point lead in the second half on Thursday night. And I mean, they fumbled the ball away. I mean, that gave the Ravens daylight, gave the Ravens an opening to get back in the football game, just like that. Winning teams find ways to win. And I know the Ravens still have the January mountain to climb. So no one's getting ahead of themselves, especially with the way this defense is right now. Because again, that is a completely different animal than anything we've talked about in the Lamar Jackson era right now. But Cincinnati, I mean, they come up small at big moments. And to your point, whether it's a decision, a coaching decision, which, as you recall, how much I despised how they handled their final kick in overtime back in Week 5. How Zach Taylor handled that situation, and then they miss a long field goal because of their operation, or whether to go or not to go, play call in a certain situation, whatever. The Bengals aren't a winning team in the way that you need to be a winning team to fancy yourself a Super Bowl contender. And look, they're 4-6. Maybe they'll string together enough wins to sneak in as a wild card, but they're certainly out of the division race at this
Well, the
point in
Ravens might
time.
not want to see them in January as much as they see the Ravens. They play the Ravens tough. I mean,
I don't think
these
anyone
games
wants
are,
to.
are not only just entertaining, but they're dangerous. I mean, the Bengals are
Okay,
dangerous for the Ravens. They are for me, maybe more so than the Bills, who feels like they handle their business against the Bills. The Bengals have 11 catches, 264 yards, and he's still catching the football, and the game's over.
yeah,
And I don't know what they would do about that.
they would do what these two games do. The Bengals self-destruct enough, and the Ravens win. I mean, at some point, and we talked about this going into Thursday night's game. When we were previewing this, at some point in time, you can keep talking about their talent. They're not winning games. They're 4-6. I mean, at some point in time, as much as people here like to complain about the Ravens and John Harbaugh, and the games that they do lose, they tend to have this tendency to beat themselves, and I get that. And I've been critical of that just as much as anyone else when it's been appropriate. But that doesn't happen to them that often. Go look at their record over the last 6 years when Lamar Jackson's healthy. They win a heck of a lot of football games, and they don't lose very many. The ones they do lose, sure, it's frustrating and maddening. But the Bengals, they do those kind of things with regularity, and that's why they're 4-6. And I'll say this: their roster, top to bottom, isn't nearly as good as the Ravens roster, top to bottom. Now, again, the defense, we're going to get into that, but I just think this Bengals team, compared to where they were 3 years ago, it's diminished in terms of depth. Their defense is certainly a shell of what it had been, starting with guys like Jesse Bates leaving. But Burrow's fantastic. He's playing at an MVP caliber level. I wouldn't put him with Lamar, but I think he's the next step down, right there with Josh Allen and
They
Jaden
didn't make a
Daniels. And
mistake all night, right? Like, I mean, through all of this on Thursday night, the wrist thing last year, the road, the noise, the lack of protection, the lack of skill position players. His second binky isn't there, right? The running game's never been there since Mixon left, right? Running back winds up fumbling the ball, after being relatively pedestrian to begin with. And I mean, they use him more of their running game is a passing game, short passing game. They use him in that way because he caught the ball 9 times, running back Brown. But Burrow, to me, it's like I don't want to say he's flawless in any way. We have Lamar here, we see Patrick Mahomes, but I look at Burrow and I think this is kind of a sorry situation for him. And I'm not as tough on the Brown family, or I mean, they've made that team good at various points, or Duke Tobin. Um, but to your point, there's a pedigree issue missing. There was an injury issue missing for them. But boy, it's not Burrow. And when I watch
No,
him, I look and I think I really believe they were going to win a Super Bowl with him there. Like Marvin left, Zach Taylor came in, and Burrow was good, and not just being out in LA at the Super Bowl 3 years ago. I still believe he's capable of winning a Super Bowl in the same way that Jared Goff and Matt Stafford and other guys were good, Josh Allen even to some degree, good enough to win a Super Bowl. He's better than that, in my opinion, in some way. And we're now getting as far into his career as we're into Lamar's career and saying, I don't know, that franchise getting back to a Super Bowl, it's got to be better than 4-6 if they want to get there.
they're not going to get to a Super Bowl. Not this year. I
Not
mean,
this year, right?
yeah, right, right. And I wasn't suggesting that you were implying that, but yeah, I mean, they don't have a very complete roster. The Ravens, okay, we can talk about the defense, and Marlon Humphrey talked about this a lot and talked about the fact that it'd be one thing if people said we didn't have the players and we didn't have the talent and all of that, but the Bengals, you just look at it and say they have talent deficiencies. Their offensive line. I mean, as maligned as the Ravens' offensive line was going into the season with three new starters, I mean, that group's held it together really well overall. It helps that you have an all-pro caliber center in Tyler Linderbaum and Ronnie Stanley looking maybe not all the way back to where he was in 2018, 2019, but the best version of him we've seen since then, certainly since the ankle injury. And the other three guys have they have their growing pains, specifically Rosengarten and Faalele, but they've been good enough. That Bengals offensive line wasn't good enough. I mean, again, think how much we've been talking about the Ravens pass rush or lack thereof and their issues. I mean, they harassed Joe Burrow quite a bit on Thursday night. And, again, you just kind of look at that team, they don't have enough. But, I feel like we're focused too much on the Bengals. What about the Ravens? What about the Ravens and the fact that you look at the Ravens offense and you say, all right, say Flowers isn't Jamar Chase, but he's pretty darn good and he's continuing to emerge. And Rashad Bateman has been a really solid number two wide receiver this year. And Mark Andrews, since the first month of the season, has looked much more Mark Andrews like. And they throw to Justice Hill out of the backfield. And obviously, the running game speaks for itself when Derrick Henry has over 1,000 yards already. And Lamar does what he does. And oh, by the way, Keaton Mitchell was activated and didn't play a whole lot on offense, as you would expect in his first game back. But now you add him to that mix as either a perimeter runner or someone who could catch passes out of the backfield. And as I mentioned, the offensive line has been good enough. It's at least been average to above average, right? I mean, it's not top five, but it's good enough. And one thing that was encouraging for me that was something that I think we've talked about is when this offensive line finds itself in true pass set situations, times where the opposition knows you're going to throw. That's where I think there's been some question, and I think that's where the Ravens have run into some trouble. But I think in that second half, they held up pretty well. And obviously, once the Ravens, erase the 14-point deficit, then it's a little bit different. And Lamar's scrambling, so that's always a factor, even if you're going to be dropping back and throwing more
Well, it
frequently.
helps
But
the offensive line that the fact that when 3rd and 12 and they're going to pass or whatever, that's troublesome. Lamar's going to take on different kind of water on that. But the way guys' hips move and the way Monken has them looking like they're going to run when they pass and looking like they're going to pass when they're going to run, that you see hips swivel. And, it's quite frankly how defenses get in trouble against them, right? Like they're not predictive. They can't be predictive, right? I mean, that's the unusual part of Lamar is that that's the one thing you have to account for in every play.
Yeah, exactly. And again, even if you're down a couple touchdowns, there's still the threat of him scrambling and taking off. And we saw that. And obviously, we know he's dealt with the knee and back issues a little bit the last couple weeks where it's limited him in practice, but never jeopardized his status for these games. But, you know, he's so unbelievable in his ability to run around. I mean, think about the scramble play where he runs what 20 yards behind the line of scrimmage just to run 30 yards forward then and he almost scores a touchdown. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I don't know. I think of NFL films and like Fran Tarkenton doing that way back when, except Lamar's a 10 times the athlete or that Fran Tarkenton was.
And so are the guys chasing him.
Sure, exactly. And
it's not Art Donovan chasing him, you know.
And I'm not saying that to be disparaging to guys of the past, but like Lamar's just we hear this so many times, someone being one of one in this day and age, and people wanting to throw out the term the GOAT all the time. Lamar is just so unique. He might be the most unique football player in NFL history. His skill set is unbelievable. And the Ravens have needed every bit of that because they're not stopping anyone. And it's not just the Bengals that they're having these issues with, right? They couldn't stop the Browns a couple weeks ago. They couldn't stop the Raiders back in game 2 when it mattered. The Cowboys who stink came back on them in the fourth quarter. So, you try to look at the context of how their defense is playing and their pass defense specifically. It's time to stop mincing words. I mean, this pass defense stinks. It stinks. Maybe they're going to find a higher level, but it's wild, Nestor. I was kind of thinking about this in the post game, and part of this might just be being loopy when it's 2 a.m. and you're wanting to get out of the press
called
box.
It trash on Thursday night because that's the only thing trash. That's what
I said my piece, but I'm starting to think like it's almost like a bizarro version of the 2000 Ravens in the sense that you have this offense that's doing historic things now, and you have a defense that I don't want to put it in the 5-game touchdown drought territory of that offense at that point in time in the middle of the 2000 season, but that's what kind of striking disparity we're seeing here. I mean, Nestor, and I know you and I've talked about Marlon Humphrey at different times, what being accountable, not being accountable, whatever, personality aside, he didn't mince words in that post game. I mean, he flat out said the defense, like he said, his quote was, "We're the little bros. Lamar's carrying us," which is fun and great, but it's not. And he said, we got to figure out ways to finish games as a defense and not force Lamar Jackson and this offense to carry us because that's
they can't cover across the middle of the field.
And that's what's so concerning. And that's what's so, bittersweet about the exciting element of this game. I mean, it was so wildly entertaining, especially for a Thursday night football game. I mean, it started slowly, as they tend to do, but
you wouldn't have even watched it had you not been in market.
This matchup I would have because and I even saw some people say before the game that this matchup was too good for Thursday night.
No
football.
One's more anti Thursday night football than Luke Jones.
Oh, I mean, it's terrible most of the time.
It's disgraceful. Yeah,
but it was great on Thursday night. But at the same time, I keep watching this offense and watching this quarterback and seeing. This is the greatest offense the Ravens have ever had, and it might not be close. And that's coming off of a year in 2023 where they did really special things in the context of franchise history. And what Lamar did in his first full season as a starter back in 2019 when they rushed for over 3,000 yards. And they were the first team in NFL history to average 200 yards passing and 200 yards rushing per game. This is historic what they're doing. Go look at their average yards per play and where that stacks up of the offenses of at least the 21st century, let's say. Understanding the game of football is so much different now than it was trying to compare anything to 1970. So they have this historic offense, but I can't help but continue to look at this defense every week and say, are they going to be the ones that ruin this in January? Because I have no confidence in this pass defense right now. And I get it. Kyle Hamilton gets hurt and you didn't have him for the second half, but they've had Kyle Hamilton in plenty of these games, and their pass defense still wasn't getting the job done. So that's where I look at this thing. And again, like I said, it's almost like a bizarro 2000 Ravens, the opposite of them, where you have this historic offense that's doing unbelievable things. You have a 27-year-old quarterback who is absolutely on his way to winning a third MVP award. I mean, that's pretty crazy. I mean, crazy. You know, fully acknowledging Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City and everything that they have to go through in January, presumably.
Well, the problem is they might not win their division.
Well, there's that,
If they
but
split with Pittsburgh and, they might finish a game behind Pittsburgh and he'll be the MVP of the league, but the defense is going to give up 440 points or something.
well, I mean, it just, but that's, whether it's winning the division, whether it's going on the road, whether it's playing in the wild card round, whatever, whatever the matchup is, even if Kansas City has a rash of injuries and they fall apart some hypothetical way, Patrick Mahomes gets hurt and is out for the season or something like that, and the Ravens work their way to the number one seed, you're still going to look at this pass defense. If we don't see some dramatic improvement between week 11 and going into the playoffs, going into January, you're going to look at this thing and say, what's going to happen when you do go up against a better defense? And let's be clear, the Ravens have put up unbelievable numbers, and I'm not diminishing that. At the same time, they have had a pretty favorable slate of defensive opponents. I know what they did against Denver last week, and I know what they did against Buffalo in week 4, but you kind of look at, by and large, most of the defenses they've played have not been a whole lot to write home about. And that's fine. That's fine. We saw them put up 24 points against Cleveland. We saw them put up 20 points against Kansas City. Those two teams have defenses that are, especially Kansas City, but even Cleveland, the capability of being a good defense.
The Chargers play defense.
They still, right. That's a good.
We're going to see that.
We're going to talk about Pittsburgh here, and obviously the Steelers. They don't have an offense that scares you, but again, I'll keep going back to the Raiders. Their season high was against the Ravens in points scored. Dallas, I think, had one game. Dallas, I think, scored more against Cleveland, but other than that, I think the Ravens were their season high in points scored. I mean, you kind of go down this list and see that all these teams tend to have their best game offensively, save for Denver. And again, if you want to fly the flag and say, but Denver with Bo Nix, then knock yourself out, I suppose. But you just look at this thing and say, if you go up against a team that has a tougher defense, that doesn't mean they're going to shut the Ravens down. Far from it. But you can't necessarily expect the Ravens to score 38 in a game like that. And if that team has a good offense, then you might be in the situation you were in week 1 against Kansas City, or even what you were in against Cleveland a couple weeks ago. And that, that's not a good team. That's not a good offense, but their defense was good enough. And we saw what happened there. So that's where I just look at this thing right now and say, my goodness, everything about this offense is just unreal at the moment. I mean, and then they just added Keaton Mitchell back to the mix, right? And we'll see what his role is as a change of pace to Derrick Henry. I mean, keep in mind, Keaton Mitchell, he led the NFL in yards per carry last year for anyone who had, I think it was 45 rushing attempts. I mean, the numbers were video game like what he was able to do. So add him into that picture now, even on a small scale. And it's another dangerous weapon. So they have everything from an MVP quarterback on down, but the defense right now scares the heck out of me in terms of what that could mean for them for January, in terms of needing to win 3 in a row to get to a Super Bowl if you're not the number 1 seed, as it certainly doesn't look like they're going to be with Kansas City still undefeated at this point. So they've got to figure out a way to get better. They have to get better defensively. This is no longer chalking it up to garbage time games or talking about the opponent you're facing or anything like that. We've just seen this week after week after week, with only a couple exceptions, that this pass defense is just bad. It's bad. When you think of Ravens' historically bad pass defenses, other than 1996, you almost always had the caveat that they were really injured. 2007, they were really injured. 2015, really injured. End of 2014, they were really injured. 2021, extremely injured by the end of the season. This defense, Kyle Hamilton's second half on Thursday night notwithstanding, this defense is missing Michael Pierce, and that's it. This is a defense that's close to full strength, as close as you can reasonably expect to be. So just think what happens if they have a couple injuries, as you're apt to do over the course of the season, and maybe even lose a guy or two for the year. So they've
including
got to
Kyle Hamilton, and we'll get to that.
Right. And fortunately, it sounds like it's not serious, but they got to figure it out, because my goodness, what a shame it would be if they waste what is such a historically special offense that's shaping up here through the first 10 games. They've got to figure it out because Lamar Jackson in this offense, maybe they are great enough to overcome it, but I'd rather not have to find that out on a week by week basis, especially as you get to January.
We will get to the defense. We will get to the offense. We'll get to the kicker. We'll get to the coaching decisions. We'll get to game action as well. Ravens still won. They still held on. They still held on the 2 point as well. At the end, didn't even need to drive the field and kick a field goal at the end. Luke Jones is Baltimore Luke anywhere the internet travels. I am Nestor. We are together putting the Maryland Crab Cake Tour back out on the road. All of our sponsors. I got my State Fair shirt on. I was waiting for the election to get over for certain things. Certainly waiting for the holidays. We're going to be at Coco's on December 4th. We're going to be at Costas next month with Gina Shock, doing a whole bunch of stuff around town. All of it brought to you by the Maryland Lottery. I'll have the Raven scratch-offs as well as some holiday. No sniffers this year. No peppermint-scented ones. They're just peppermint, but they don't smell like peppermint, so my bag doesn't smell like peppermint. Also, our friends at Jiffy Lube Multi-Care, powering Luke back and forth. He'll get a little bit of downtime here, but we get back on regular schedule again next week. And the Steelers and quick weekend here, fast sleep, as they say. Presidential changes. We're going to be doing segments on that as we do the Crab Cake Tour as well, and the 26th anniversary of the Maryland Oyster Tour presented by Curio Wellness and Far and Daughter, as well as our friends at Liberty Pure Solution, 1-800-CLEAN-WATER. If you need any plumbing or if you need well water services, they are the best. Luke's the best too. Out late, up early, talking football. And it's not even a Monday morning. I'm Nestor. He's Luke. We are WNST AM 1570. It's House in Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore positive.